They called him a baboon, murderer, slave lover. And they called him the great emancipator, savior of the Union, a saint. I called him friend and partner. This little sign here used to hang outside our office, Lincoln and Herndon. The day he left for Washington, he said, "Billy, let that sign hang. If I live, I'm coming back. We're going to continue practicing law just as if nothing ever happened." Well, something happened. And he did not return to Springfield, leastwise, not to practice law. Now, we moved into that office on the northwest corner of the square after he returned from his one term in Congress. Spent a lot of time there together. It was a good time for me. Law office is a good place to be if you like stories of robbery and murder and fraud and such like. And well, who doesn't? You know, we had a sofa in that office where he would come in and stretch out his 6'4" and read out loud from a book or newspaper. If I was working on a case, I'd say to him, "Abe, hush up, I got work to do." And he said to me, "Billy, I like to read out loud. That way I catch the idea by two senses. I see and I hear what I'm reading. I remember it better." Well, sometimes I had to leave the office just to get my work done. After he'd finished reading, he'd want to tell a story or a riddle or a new joke he heard. Yeah, I miss you, Abe. I miss your stories, your jokes. 20 years have gone by, and this world is still filled with your presence. To tell one man's truth, that's what I have dedicated my life to since he was taken from us. And for a long time now, I've been chasing him like a dog chasing a fox. Now I feel like I know him better than he knew himself, better than I know myself. Sometimes I forget who I am, but in my memory, in my notes, I have bits and pieces from here and there, and I've been putting them together to make a man. I can see him now before me, his face with a sad, pleading look, his brow narrow and high, cheekbones high, sharp, and prominent, his nose large and blunt, jaws long and strong, and on his right cheek, just above the right corner of his mouth, was a mole. But this is only his physical likeness. The Lincoln I propose to show you is the real Lincoln. The Lincoln of the Kentucky dirt floor cabin. Lincoln of the backwoods village of New Salem. Lincoln of Gettysburg. I want you to see Lincoln, the father, the husband, the spinner of yarns, the shrewd politician, and finally Lincoln, the president and martyr. After I returned from his funeral here in Springfield, I determined to devote my life to telling this man's true story. Now I feel like I know him very well. He was not a perfect man, but all in all, he was a good man. My way has not been easy. Herndon is a liar, they say. Herndon is a drunkard, they say. Herndon is a drug addict, they say. Herndon is ungrateful, they say. Well, I confess some of these charges are true. I am far from perfect. When I started my searches for the real Lincoln, I sold the business in Springfield and moved my family out to the farm my father left for me. And I have failed as a farmer. Beetles got my potatoes. My mule got killed. Hogs got cholera. Fruit trees died. And I developed bronchial trouble. My way has not been easy. Dear Mr. Herndon, you are the last man who ought to write a life of Lincoln. Your long and intimate association with him unfits you for the task. Well, that's what they say. But I have ignored the taunts of my critics, and I'm determined to give the world the real Lincoln. And let me ask you, is there a man better qualified? Let me tell you who I am. Like Lincoln, I was born in Kentucky, in Greensburg, about 9 years after him. I was a small town boy when my family moved to the Illinois country in 1843. I was admitted to the bar and entered into a partnership with Lincoln that lasted until his death. That's who I am. Finding the truth of any man is not easy. Finding Lincoln's truth has been very, very hard. He was a riddle. He was a puzzle. He was a mystery, even to his friends and family. You want to know the causes of his power? You want to know the secrets of his success? You want to know what he really believed? Well, much has been said and written about it already. Much of it is false. If he were here today, he would say to me, tell the truth, Billy. Tell the truth. Don't varnish me. Well, Mr. Lincoln, I'll do my best. Lincoln, you know, was one of us. He was a Western man, men with roots in Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, men of giant strength. Now, we were not men of culture and education, as they say out east, but we were men of stamina, generosity, courage. In the years of 1815 to 1830, the years of Lincoln's boyhood and young manhood, only the strong and determined could get here, and only the very strong could survive here. Grant was Grant. Douglas was Douglas, and Lincoln was Lincoln, and he was like no other. If he'd been a man of all culture and polish, well, he might have made a good country lawyer, but he never would have become this nation's president. You see, it all goes back a long way. Back before he moved to Springfield, he was living out in the backwoods village of New Salem. When he came to Springfield to establish himself as a lawyer, I was clerking in Joshua Speed's store. Now, Speed and Lincoln and I, we shared the room above Speed's general store. I spent countless hours listening to Speed and Lincoln and other gentlemen argue law and philosophy and politics, and listen to the old gentlemen tell stories around the Cracker Barrel at Speed's general store. I never understood why he took me into partnership, but he did in the fall of 43. Now, maybe it's because he could already see his way was going towards politics. Maybe it was because he saw I had no political ambitions whatsoever. He once said, you can't run a law office when all the lawyers want to be congressmen. Well, people say I became angry with Abe, vindictive, when he didn't offer me an office in his administration. Now that is a bald-faced lie, as anyone knows who knows me. Fact is, he did offer me an office. I didn't take it. I said, Mr. Lincoln, give your office to somebody else. I want to be free to drink whiskey when I please. As some of Abe's biographers have said, he never touched a drop of liquor in his life. Well, he didn't drink much, but he never signed the temperance pledge. You know, I remember the night he was nominated for president. He had 2 or 3 beers with the boys just to steady his nerves. You know, back then, everybody drank, even preachers. He once said, "I don't drink much, but I deserve no credit for that. I hate the stuff. Makes me feel flabby and undone." But you see, that's the way he was in all his habits, temperate. He didn't eat much. Seemed to eat because it was necessary, not because he liked it. Yeah, but you couldn't get much good food out on the circuit anyway. He loved to eat apples, liked a good cup of coffee. Didn't eat much at home, but that's another story for another time. Now, when he was still in Congress, he had not yet become an abolitionist, but he was headed that direction by his opposition to the Mexican War. Now, like most people, he saw that war as a war of aggression aimed at adding more slave territory to the Union. He said that people that disagreed with him reminded him of that old Illinois farmer who kept adding hundreds and hundreds of acres to his farm, all the while insisting, "Well, shucks, I ain't greedy about land. I just want what joins mine." But Lincoln showed from the start he was not afraid to take the unpopular side. See, most people supported that war, and Lincoln's position nearly killed him politically. In fact, by 1850, his political future looked almost dead. It was the so-called Compromise of 1850, hammered out by Henry Clay, that brought his spirits so low, because the new laws seemed to favor slavery and seal the fate of the American slave forever. Clay thought the compromise would save the Union. That didn't save the Union. Lincoln did. Then in 1854, the darkness became deeper and more permanent when Senator Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska bill. Now, on the surface, that bill merely allowed people in the new territories to choose their own institutions. But in reality, it allowed slavery to move into the new territories. And then in 1857, the Dred Scott decision declared that slaves were property whether they were in a slave state or a free state. That brought Lincoln to a fever pitch. Our office became a beehive of new ideas and reforms. We talked founding a state university. We talked women's rights. But most of all, we talked and debated politics. We were obsessed with Stephen Douglas. We wanted him out of the Senate. So in 1857, Lincoln ran against him, and again he lost. The Illinois legislature again chose Douglas. While losing, however, he positioned himself to become the next president of the United States. Because you see, those famous debates with Douglas established him as a national figure and the spokesman for abolition. Now that was a position he was slow in coming to. 20 years before, in New Orleans, his heart bled to see those slaves whipped and beaten and scourged, but he said nothing. From boyhood, he had admired the slaves' stamina, their grit, their grace under pressure. But he had not yet come out publicly against slavery. See, now I know. He was biding his time, waiting for the moment to strike. I remember a day in our office. I was angry at him because he was slow in working on a case. And he said to me, "Billy, I'm like a long, strong jackknife, doubled up in the handle. Takes longer to open a jackknife than it does a short little woman's knife. But when that jackknife is opened, it cuts wider and deeper. This little notebook here, you can see it at about 4 by 6 inches, fastens with a brass clasp. This little notebook is the most prized possession in my Lincoln collection. In it, he pasted in articles, newspaper essays, tables of statistics. It was the raw material for those famous debates with Douglas. It was his ammunition. And when he had filled it up, he fastened that brass clasp, put it in his pocket, and said, "Now, I'm ready for Douglas." 185 separate entries. On the first page is the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which, as you know, contains Jefferson's sacred words. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." A little further down, paragraph from a speech by Henry Clay, in which he said, "I repeat, sir, I cannot and will not, and no earthly power can make me look to move slavery into places where it does not now exist. Never, while reason holds her seat in my brain. Never, while my heart sends vital fluids through my veins. Never." And there you have it. Lincoln's two heroes, Clay, Jefferson, both of them men of freedom, both of them slave owners. And that was the American paradox Lincoln faced, a country founded on liberty and justice and slavery. Well, now, slavery was only one of many critical issues facing the nation at that time. But there was always room along the campaign for a little humor. At one stop, Senator Douglas said, "My opponent used to work in a grocery store where he sold not only household goods, but cigars and whiskey. Let me tell you, my opponent was a good bartender." Well, Lincoln knew how to handle that. What Mr. Douglas says is true. Many a time I stood on my side of the counter and poured whiskey for Mr. Douglas on the other side. The difference now between us is I have left my side of the counter, but Mr. Douglas is still drinking whiskey on his side. Well, still a long way from that little office in Springfield to the White House. But if any man understood his time, Lincoln did. And slavery was for him the brass ring of opportunity. It's the horse he rode to Washington. Now, you know he did not start out an abolitionist. But by 1850, the new Republican Party offered him the chance of becoming president, but that chance would only be given to the man who could win over the abolitionists of the North, men like Horace Greeley, Sumner, Seward. These were the men who could put him in the White House. Trouble was, they didn't believe he was strong enough in his opposition to slavery. They needed to be convinced. Well, the opportunity came. Fall of '59, he was invited to speak in New York. I remember well the day that invitation came. He came stooping through that door, came up to me and said, "Billy, should I go? And if I go, what should I talk on?" And I said, "Mr. Lincoln, by all means go. This is the opportunity you've been waiting for. And talk on politics. It's your best subject. It'll lead you to the White House." The meeting was held in the Cooper Union, February 1860. And in his speech, he looked forward to the end of slavery everywhere. He ended with these words, "Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government, nor of dungeons to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might. And in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it." Horace Greeley thought it was the best political speech he'd ever heard. It paved his way for his triumphant march through New England and New York. At whistle stops, he would come out on the platform of the rear car and say, "I hold this truth to be self-evident, that what is right in Connecticut is right in South Carolina. What is wrong in Connecticut is wrong in South Carolina. I hold human slavery to be wrong in Connecticut. And I hold human slavery to be wrong, eternally wrong, in South Carolina." Well, it was close. He lost the popular vote, but he won the electoral. Now, I didn't see the new president-elect much. After the election, he was surrounded by office seekers. They were rolled in the dust, kissed his boots, asked for a tail or a hair from the tail of his old horse. Disgusting carnival. The next day, the day before he left for Washington, he stopped by the office, came in, plopped himself down on that sofa. We were mostly quiet. Then we talked some. After a while, he stood up, gathered up some books and papers, and we walked downstairs, shook hands goodbye. I watched that tall, gaunt, stooping figure disappear down the street. And my heart ached with loneliness. The country had a new president, but I had lost my best friend and partner. The next day, he said farewell to Springfield. It was a cold February morning. The railroad yard was filled with people. And he came out on the rear car and he said, "My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born. One is buried. And now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I shall return, with a task before me greater than that which faced Washington himself. Without the assistance of that divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. To his care commending you, and as I hope you will in your prayers, commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. He knew his inaugural address would be read by abolitionists and slave owners alike, and he wanted to get it right. He reached out generous hands to both sides. He urged patience and caution. And he ended with these words: "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone across this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." Well, he moved too slow for me. But he was president, I was not, but he moved too slow. The country was in turmoil. More and more states were seceding. And then they forced him to move when the rebels fired on Union troops. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The war had begun. Battle lines were drawn. Blood began to be spilled, and yet he hesitated and hesitated and hesitated to do anything about slavery. Horace Greeley said he has no plan or policy. Lincoln responded to that. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. Now, do not misunderstand me. Lincoln detested slavery. He was by nature anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, he said, nothing is wrong. But the war dragged on. More and more people killed. But finally he felt the time had come. The hour was ripe to free the slaves. He issued a warning in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. There was no response. So on January 1st, 1863, he declared, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in a time of armed actual rebellion against authority of government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do on this first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states or parts of states are and henceforward shall be free. And with a stroke of a military pen, the reluctant emancipator freed 4 million people. Now, freeing the slaves was not the end of his troubles. Not by a long shot. In 1864, he had to call up 500,000 men. Many, he knew, would not return. The knowledge he was sending them into the jaws of death weighed heavily on Lincoln. At a military hospital in City Point, Major Charles Houghton lay dying. He was wounded while serving at Fort Haskell under General Grant. He was brought to the hospital to die. He lingered in the borderland between life and death. Early one morning, the door at the rear of the ward opened. The chief surgeon called out, "The President of the United States." Lincoln came in, stopping to say a word of encouragement to the wounded. And then he approached Houghton's bed and he asked, "Is this the man that saved Fort Haskell?" Then the president asked for a chair. He sat down and put his stovepipe hat on the dusty floor. He took Houghton's hand in his. And then the president did a strange thing. He asked to see the wound. The nurses and surgeons tried to dissuade him, but he insisted. And he watched as they unwound the long, blood-stained bandage. And he saw. And he stood up with his arms outstretched and said, "Oh, this war. This awful, awful war." Tears coming down his face. And he sat down again beside the bed. And he kissed Houghton on his forehead, just below the damp hairline, and said to him in his ear, "You must live. You must live." Houghton struggled to open his eyes. And then he pulled his hand up to his temple in a pale salute and said, "I intend to, sir." And he did. He lived. Such acts of compassion I have heard from so many people throughout my travels searching for the true Lincoln. But do not misunderstand me. Lincoln was a tough president. If he'd been a man of all heart, this country would have gone to ruin, as it almost did. But all those people thought this country was going to hell were dead wrong. Oh, in 1863, there were signs of victory. Even before the re-election, he was looking forward to the next term. A little place in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. He was asked to speak at a dedication of National Cemetery. His place on the list was an afterthought. The main speaker was Edward Everett, the great orator, whose speech took up 2 sides of a newspaper page. Lincoln's was a little shorter, under 300 words. It's a great speech. I think it bears repeating. 87 years ago, Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on the great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world would little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Now, Lincoln was burdened with a sorry lot of generals. Then he found some generals who could win the war for him. You know their names: Sheridan, Sherman, Grant, who, like me, was a little too fond of his whiskey. One day a contingent came to Lincoln. They wanted Grant removed from his post. They went through all kinds of reasons. Finally, they came to the real reason. Well, Mr. Lincoln, he drinks. Lincoln said, well, what does he drink? They said, well, Mr. Lincoln, whiskey, and in unusual quantities. Lincoln said, well, find out what brandy drinks and send a barrel of it to my other generals. Grant wins victories. Well, the news got better and better for the North in the winter of 64, spring of 65. Sherman delivered Savannah to Lincoln as a Christmas gift, while Grant surrounded Lee in Virginia. Then in April, Sherman moved up through the Carolinas, and Lee, facing insurmountable odds, surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. He'd done it. He kept the Union together. Now, he wanted to see the big prize. Above all else, he wanted to see the capital of the Confederacy again under federal control. He wanted to see Richmond with his son Tad in hand and an old Negro slave, ex-slave, by his side. He walked the mile and a half down through the city. And the freed slaves were dancing and shouting and singing, and they kneeled down before him, and he said, "Oh no, do not kneel to me. You must kneel to God only. I am but God's instrument. But I promise you, as long as I live, no man shall ever put a shackle on your limbs again. And an old ex-slave tipped his hat to Lincoln. Lincoln tipped his hat to the old gentleman. When news of Lee's surrender reached Springfield, the town went wild with joy. There were 21-gun salutes, fireworks, parties, and the fire department started a parade around the town square. And a donkey with an effigy of Jeff Davis with a placard on the back saying, "Jeff Davis' last ride." And a placard on the back of the donkey saying, "Lee's end." And the town went to bed that night drunk with the joy of victory. In Washington, bands serenaded the White House with songs like Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, the Star-Spangled Banner, and then Lincoln said, "Play Dixie. It's ours again." Well, the war was almost over, but the last act of the bloody drama was yet to be played out. Lincoln knew his life was always in danger. There'd been assassinations attempts before. Trouble was, he didn't have time to worry about it. He was too busy. His day began early and ended late. After dinner, he would meet with congressmen and generals about affairs of the state and war. But every once in a while, he would take a night off and go hear a lecture, a concert, go to a play. He did not want to go see Our American Cousin that Friday night. He'd seen it before, wasn't good enough to see again. Unfortunately, he gave in to Mrs. Lincoln's insistence, and you know what happened. 5 days earlier, we were drunk with joy, and now we were overcome with grief. In Springfield, church bells tolled their sad requiem. Mourning wreaths were placed on every door. Men gathered around the telegraph for news, while over in the cemetery, the earth was being prepared to receive her son. And lilacs garlanded the earth. Apple trees blossomed pink and white for Lincoln's homecoming. It had happened. He had returned to the people from whom he'd sprung and to whom he knew he must one day return. Many people have said Lincoln was a deeply religious man. He was not. He had no dogma, no creed. But all in all, he was as near perfect a man as God generally makes. If Washington was this country's creator, Lincoln was its savior. In my searches for the real Lincoln, I went to his boyhood home, southern Indiana. And I walked the fields where he had helped his father plant crops and harvest the crops to feed the family. Walked beneath the apple trees they had planted half a century before. And then they took me down the trail about half a mile to where his mother lay buried. It was unmarked, sunken, overgrown with brush and briar. I hitched my horse to a nearby tree, and I knelt down by that poor, neglected grave. If I could whisper in your ear, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, your son was president of these United States.